Hi, I'm Chris Ridding. I run the Learning Loop podcast. And in each of these episodes, I tell you how to take Learning Loop, which is my philosophy for stopping forgetting what can help you solve your problems, and doing so through these three steps of making the wisdom that you acquire in your life permanent by writing it down in your notes and writing down what seems to matter in your notes. And then, secondly, making that wisdom accessible to a future you. So that means organizing and rewriting your notes so that you can understand it when you need it, and so you can find it when you need it. And then, third, actually find it when you need it and use it to solve your problems and answer your questions. And this is all kind of based on this central thesis that I think that there's nobody who is better equipped to answer your questions and solve your problems than you are. But we forget so much of what we've learned in the moment where we need it. And so, in the past, I've explained what Learning Loop is. I've had people on the show to kind of debate it, whether it's valid, whether it's useful. I've gone into these specific constructs and case studies of how I use it. And today I wanted to talk about a problem that I have solved in my own use of Learning Loop. So I think Learning Loop is a thing that sounds like a great process. It sounds very sensible. You write down things that you need to remember in the future that can be useful, find those things when you need them, and then use them. What could go wrong? Well, let me take you to a Monday morning in my life. Oftentimes on Monday morning, I've not eaten the healthiest food on Sunday night. I wake up, I might be kind of out of touch with exactly what I need to do for my job, exactly what's highest leverage, exactly what's highest priority that week. And time again, I find myself waking up in the morning and really not wanting to get out of bed and starting my to do list, even though I know abstractly and rationally that many times that I've done my to do list, I've felt really good as I'm doing it. But I can't seem to feel this on Monday morning. And so I'll sit there and I'll notice that it's pretty ironic that last Thursday evening or last Wednesday evening, I felt like, oh, I wish I had more time to do all these things that I'm super excited about. And juxtapose that with this current moment where I don't feel like getting up and doing anything. There's an irony there. And the irony is furthered when I'm making this podcast about Learning Loop, and I know that there is all this wisdom in my notes that I've written down to solve this exact problem of not feeling motivated to get up and do exactly what I need to do. But I can't seem to go into my notes and find useful wisdom for this problem of motivation. And so I'm sitting there Monday morning asking myself, what's going on here? And I think that I've come up with some vocabulary for what's going on here in terms of the what problems are happening. And I think I've come up with a tool to solve that problem. And so the problem that I want to address today is not knowing how to consult or enter into your notes in order to problem solve. So I have this problem of I'm not motivated on a Monday morning. And I know that there are wisdoms, but I can't get into my notes. And so I came up with this tool called the Learning Loop Bootstrap that I want to show you a demo of. And I want to introduce some vocabulary that will be useful for addressing this problem. And I want to talk about a principle that I think this implies. But first, let's get very specific about what problem we're trying to solve. So, you've written down a ton of notes. You've done step one of Learning Loop. And then down the line, a month later, 2 months later, you have a problem. You have an intuition. I've faced this problem before. The wisdom is probably in my notes, right? So why don't you just look? Well, I think that the reason is because notes are overwhelmingly big. If you've taken a lot of notes, if they're not perfectly organized, you can ask yourself validly, rationally, where and how do I find what I need? I don't even know maybe what I'm asking or feeling there are many different ways to express this problem. Like, am I dealing with motivation, or am I dealing with boredom, or am I dealing with laziness? Like, I might have a page for each one of those things. And so it's not the case that there's just one place to go in my notes. So I feel like it'd be useful to have a word for what it's called to enter into your notes. So I call this an entry point. This is a point at which you enter into your notes. So if you go to a page, like I have this page called Overcome that I often go to overcome my problems. That's an entry point. Or a section in a page. Like in my principles page, I have a bunch of principles sections. And one of them is my planning by intending, executing, and reviewing. That's a principle that I use often, and I know it's there. And so I might go to that as an entry point. Or it could be raw text. Like I know that I have this vision board page, which is supposed to paint this picture of my ideal life. And I kind of have an idea roughly of what's in that text. And so these are all things that I can kind of grab in my mind as a way that I would go into my notes. Those are called entry points. And then there are these things that I want to call terminal points. A terminal point is the wisdom that you go to your notes for. And so it might be a section in the Overcome page where I go to Overcome because I know I need to overcome something. And then there's a section to overcome FOMO. There's a section to overcome sleepiness. There's a section to overcome depression. There's a section to overcome lack of motivation. And in lack of motivation, there might be all these things that I've done in the past that were really effective for overcoming a lack of motivation. And one of those things might be write down the purpose of what you want, write down the purpose of what you're about to do in the broader context of things. What's it going to mean for your career? What's it going to mean for your family? What's it going to feel like when you're on stage launching this deliverable that you're working on? That kind of thing. And these terminal points are not things that are readily available in your mind. You have to find your way to them in your notes through the entry points. And the path that you follow from your entry point to the terminal point, I'm just going to call that a path. And so from overcome to the problem I need to overcome, lack of motivation, to the approach that I take to overcoming lack of motivation. And once I've found that wisdom, then I might overcome this problem. So we have entry points, terminal points, and paths. And I think that the reason that it's useful, to introduce these terms is that usually there is a problem with knowing how to enter into your notes, and it's usually not that there aren't good wisdoms in your notes. There's usually the problem of A, you don't know where to start, in which case the problem is that you don't have good entry points because what you're trying to express is maybe ambiguous or it's difficult to articulate or doesn't match any of the entry points that you've created. Another problem is that if you do know where to start, but you aren't led organically to the wisdoms that you need, then you don't have good paths. So your mind might know subconsciously that you don't have good entry points because you've gone and you've been confused about where to go into your notes, or you might have gone to a good entry point and you might have gotten lost in the weeds because you haven't built yourself a solid path from the entry point to the terminal point, what ultimately you're getting out of your notes. And if you do this enough times unsuccessfully, then your mind is going to learn to associate the act of consulting your notes with no reward at all. So, what is the solution here? Well, what I want to do is I want to overcome my problem. I want to overcome this feeling that I have on Monday morning of I'm not motivated to do the things that I need to do. So I came up with this concept of a bootstrap. The first step of a bootstrap of three, there are 3 steps in a bootstrap. The first step is to write down a cue. So I would write on the Monday morning, I'm having a hard time with motivation. I would just say, I don't want to do my to-do list. I'm having a hard time with motivation. I know that I should take advantage of the time that's in front of me, but I'm having a hard time compelling myself to. I've written down the cue, which is a problem. And the cue is supposed to elicit a response. Okay. And how I've presented this to you in the past has been you write down a cue and then you go into your notes to look for answers to the problem. The problem with that, I think, is that sometimes there are not good entry points and paths, and you will not find that it works because you've never successfully done it and you haven't set yourself up for success in that particular problem. So instead, I introduce this second intermediate step, which is write down a natural reaction. That is, write down a reaction that's unassisted by learning loop. Just respond to the cue. So I write down, I have a hard time with motivation, and then I write down, maybe what I should do is, and I just think of what I should do. Maybe I should take a cold shower. Maybe I should write down the purpose of what I'm doing. Maybe I should, and after I come up with 3 or 4 things, maybe I'm going to say, it's hard for me to come up with more things. And so I've written down my natural reaction. And then a third step is to write down a note-supported reaction. Write down a learning loop reaction by consulting your notes. And so write down a cue, write down a natural reaction, just according to your thoughts, and then write down a note-supported reaction, actually consulting your notes and actually practicing learning loop. So there are several benefits of this. There are several reasons why I think that it works. So I think that one of the problems with good entry points is that when you have a problem, you know in your mind that it could be called one of many different things. I was talking about motivation being, is that laziness? Is it boredom? Is it depression? Is it lack of motivation? I might have a page for each one of those things, and I don't want to read through 4 entire pages. It just sounds daunting. And so if I force myself to write a cue, then I'm forcing myself just to kind of guess at what the best terminology for what I'm experiencing is. And in this case, I wrote about lack of motivation. And so once I've done that, it's really useful to write it down as opposed to just think about it in your head, because then you're forcing it into language that then you can use to problem solve. That then you can use to go into learning loop somewhere, go into your notes, and actually problem solve. If you bootstrap, you will be forced to say something, even if it's not the perfect thing, and upon writing it down, it will feel correct or incorrect. And with a little bit of iteration, you can get it correct. And then it feels like a warm-up for knowing where to consult your notes because you've done the attempt of write down a cue, write down a reaction. You also practice solving a problem on your own. Like, learning loop is great because it helps you to do a thing that you cannot do, which is to remember a lot of what you've realized in the past or wisdom that you've learned in the past. You're never going to remember everything. And learning loop is trying to close the gap between what you've learned and what you will remember at any given point. But it would be ideal if you could remember as much as possible on your own, because that way in a conversation or during a speech or during whatever kind of exercise where you would use a learning loop, you could do it organically rather than relying on your notes. So when you write down the natural reaction, you're forcing yourself to come up with a cognitive reaction as opposed to an embodied note-assisted reaction. And that helps you avoid using your notes as crutches. Instead, they are augments. Instead, they are tools that take your good, natural, skillful reaction and they boost it. So an additional benefit of this is that when you have a natural reaction and then you have a note boosted reaction, if there is a difference between them, then that's proof that learning loop is working. It's proof that learning loop is doing something that you couldn't have done on your own. And that's very exciting because then you see in your learning loop assisted reaction, this thing, I didn't come up with in my natural reaction. And you're like, oh, those things I couldn't have gotten. And if any of those were really helpful, then you know learning loop is working. The last thing that I'll say is regarding this dopamine prediction error, which is a huge part of learning in cognitive science, neuroscience, reinforcement learning. I'm an AI researcher, and so I think a lot about the extent to which machine learning algorithms and models and we learn by being wrong. You don't learn by having nearly as effectively by somebody else telling you the answer as if you guess and then are shown the distinction and the delta and the difference between what you guessed and what you generated and what was the right answer. And so there's a little bit of surprise in you seeing what you come up with naturally and what you could have come up with if you looked at Learning Loop. And that will help you learn the things that you came up with in Learning Loop. It's like when you're reading a book and you guess what the author is going to say next, and it's not that, which it very often will not be, you're going to learn what the author said better than if you hadn't guessed. So these are the benefits of the bootstrap in my mind, of writing down the cue, writing down a natural reaction, and then writing down a Learning Loop augmented reaction. So I want to take you through a couple of concrete examples of where this has gone really, really well for me, and I found the Learning Loop trace to be very helpful. All right, so here's an example of a Learning Loop trace that I did the other day. I wrote down a cue, which was, I am feeling depressed, like I can't be happy ever, like I can't believe in God, like I can't. Not the most precise or articulate cue, but nonetheless something that I felt. And so I could just consult my notes, but I am practicing a Learning Loop trace or a bootstrap, and so I am going to write down a natural reaction. My natural reaction is I should do my morning routine, because apparently I felt this in the morning. I should consult my values. I know that one of my values is this: progress, faith, and meaning is my first personal value. I should consult my goals, which I can think of off the top of my head. There is this certain goal. I hope to be a father and a good husband. I hope to have a successful career. I should consult my current quarter. I am on track to launch K-Prize, my main deliverable of the quarter. I should consult my current week, week 10. I did really well on my disciplines that week. I had been doing very well on my disciplines that week. And so, that should give me some motivation. That should give me some happiness. I don't know. And then my gratitude page. Like I know that I'm very grateful for my girlfriend's love, my friends, my family, that I live in a beautiful place, that I have autonomy in my career. So these are things that I thought I should consult with my natural reaction. And then I also thought I should explain why I'm depressed and why I can't be happy forever and why I can't believe in God. And so I explained, I think it's because last night I couldn't sleep and I woke up really tired. I think it's because I ate too much. And so this is my natural reaction. This is what I thought would help me. And I said, okay, that gives me a lot of stuff to go into. It shows me some entry points. It shows me some candidate terminal values too. Or terminal points. So values and progress, faith, meaning, goals, and I hope to be a good father and husband, et cetera, et cetera. So then I did a Learning Loop reaction and I found extra stuff. So in my values page where I consulted, I found another principle: gratitude, humility, and presence in the current chapter. I kind of got this with consult my gratitude page, but there are elements here that are distinct from the gratitude up here. Like this is like a social and professional and locational gratitude, but this is kind of like bringing in this idea of presence and just being grateful for the current point in time, which is helpful. I have a goal to know that God is real as opposed to just believe that God is real. And I want to be closer to God after my current chapter professionally than before my current chapter professionally. I went into my current quarter, I guess didn't really find anything valuable there. There was a thing I was really grateful for, which is my agency and my autonomy. There was this thinking trap, which is spiritual experience is a spurious correlation, taking advantage of things. I don't want to get super into this, but like there is this thing that I have called the thinking trap in the past, which seems to be what I'm experiencing up here. And so I have this Learning Loop reaction, which is distinct from my natural reaction. And so the review, which is how I felt by the end. I write it down. By the end of this, I felt cured of my depression and felt itchy to start doing, felt very effective. I feel grateful, in touch with God, emboldened, energetic, and full of faith and drive. What the Q actually meant was, I'm feeling sad right now, discouraged about the rate of my progress, feeling entitled to a stronger testimony than I have. It called for less entitlement, more humility, and more gratitude and faith. And so this process worked. So you can see this bootstrap. I was between the word bootstrap and trace for this construct of what we're doing here with the cue, the natural reaction, the learning loop reaction, because the bootstrap suggests that you're picking yourself up by your bootstraps, like you're starting with nothing, or you're starting with less than you need ultimately, which that gets in the natural reaction. But then the trace is like you're following this arc, you're following this kind of pit of despair in this case, a natural reaction, which is somewhat effective maybe for getting you out of the pit, and then a learning loop reaction, which is like very effective for getting you out of the pit. And cumulatively, where I wind up from the cue to the review is I was down here and now I'm way up here because of the effectiveness of this exercise. And I think that learning loop only makes this exercise more effective. And so this is an example of really helpful learning loop trace that I did, a really helpful learning loop bootstrap. I think that the bootstrap and the trace, I think it implies something, that this worked so well for me and it solves a problem that I've been facing, which is not knowing how to get into my notes. It implies, I think, this principle of being outcome oriented, not process oriented, because the most elegant, adhered to, abstractly correct principles just can fail to deliver what you were really after all along. So you should pay attention to whether what you're doing works. I came up with this tool of bootstrapping because I was frustrated learning loop wasn't working. It wasn't sticky for me. When I was in pain, faced with a problem, it wasn't natural for me to pull out my notes and consult them. But the learning loop reaction that I showed you in that learning loop trace, and in many of the other learning loop traces that I've done since I came up with this construct, have been super, super helpful. And so I guess that I would just say that the principle, like these tools that I introduce, you don't have to do exactly the learning loop bootstrap. You don't have to do exactly the learning loop trace. But by telling this story of I had a hard time getting into my notes because the entry points and paths and terminal points, I didn't have the language, and coming up with language helped me identify the problem and formalize the problem and help me put my finger on it. And then once I put my finger on it, I was able to come up with this tool. And the principle of being outcome oriented, not process oriented, can inform how you come up with your own tools. I mean, you should try the learning loop trace. You should try the learning loop bootstrap because it might help a lot for you. You know, it's basically cognitive restructuring augmented by learning loop, which is a really, really powerful tool and it's really evidence-based in cognitive behavioral therapy. So I don't know, like what's standing in the way of you consulting the letters of wisdom that you wrote to yourself in the past in your notes? Is it the unarticulated mess of thought that is prompting the searching for those letters? Do you need to be more precise with how you cue yourself? Is it that your notes don't have good entry points? Is it that your notes don't have good paths? Do you need to spend more time on the most important pages that you use to solve your most important problems? Maybe. So today is an invitation to kind of reflect on this problem of not knowing how to consult or enter into your notes to problem solve or answer questions. Do you struggle with that? If so, this learning loop bootstrap might be a useful tool for you. But if you don't do the learning loop bootstrap, I think that this principle of being outcome oriented, not process oriented, allows you to be very creative, allows you to be very adaptive, allows you to custom tailor the processes that I talk about in a way that works for you, because it's the outcomes that matter, not the process. So I would love to hear what you think about this new construct. I'd love to hear counter arguments. I'd love to hear supporting points of view, opposing points of view. Please reach out. Please comment. Please let me know if this resonates or not. Am I totally crazy? Am I totally wackadoodle for saying the things that I'm saying? Anyways, thanks for coming. And hope to see you next week.